Hi, everyone. In this presentation, I'm going to cover virtue ethics, which may be the earliest kind of ethical theory in human civilization. Ironically, it's also one of the most popular ones recently because it's experienced a type of renaissance over the last few decades. So to explore this theory more deeply, I'm going to look at Douglas Giles' How Can I Be a Better Person? And in this article, he says he's going to cover Aristotle's virtue ethics, Aquinas' Christian version of Aristotelian virtue ethics, Buddhist virtue ethics, and Taoist and Confucian virtue ethics. For the sake of this presentation, however, and not to go too long, I'm just going to focus on Aristotle's virtue ethics. I will include some links in the description down below where you can find other readings on some of these other ones. But for this presentation, we're just going to look at Aristotle. So what is virtue ethics? Giles says, quote, in philosophies of virtue ethics, rather than an emphasis on following rules, the emphasis is on developing oneself as a good person. It is not that following rules is not important. It is more the sense that being ethical means more than simply following rules. So when you think about ethics, you might actually think about rule following, right? Doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing, following this rule and not breaking that one. But it seems like the virtue ethicist has a point that the moral life is much more than just following the rules. It has to do with having the right character, having the right motivation, having the right emotions, and also, consequences are important as well. We're going to look at other ones later on, other moral theories, and we'll explore each one of these aspects of morality or ethics more deeply. But for now, let's look closer at virtue ethics. So virtue ethicists, he says, advocate the cultivation of wisdom and character that people can use to internalize basic ethical principles from which they can determine the ethical course of action in particular situations. And so take, for example, the principle of honesty. You can take this principle, internalize it, and make it part of who you are. In other words, be an honest person. And then when you get into particular situations, the idea goes that you can actually know how to apply this principle. You can actually know how to be honest in any particular situation. Now, Aristotle, writing 2,000 years ago, he thinks that human nature is objective. He thinks that understanding ethics and morality is about understanding our nature and our proper function. And that's what he has to say or share with us in the Nicomachean ethics. I'll also provide a link to that down below as well. Aristotle believed, quote, that our purpose is to pursue our proper end, eudaimonia, which is best understood as human flourishing or living well. So this Greek word eudaimonia has been translated in different ways. It's often translated as just happiness, but the English word happiness doesn't fully capture what the Greek word really means. And probably a better translation, although it's not so common in English, is to use the word flourishing. So eudaimonia means flourishing. And so if you want to flourish as a human being, Aristotle thinks you're going to have to live a life of virtue. So this goal, or eudaimonia, as the author says here, is the purpose or the function or final goal of a human life. Now, this might be controversial. If you get into it, it makes certain assumptions that there is a human nature to begin with, that there is a goal or set of goals that are available to us human beings, and that by fulfilling those goals, that's what's going to make us happy. So as you can imagine, philosophers have had enough to say about what these goals are and whether they can even be identified. But this is what Aristotle thinks. Let's continue. Giles says, quote, Aristotle defines human good as the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. So in other words, if you want to live a full, happy life, you've got to live a virtuous life. So what is virtue? Scrolling down here. Virtue is a character trait needed to live well. And this quote comes right out of the Nicomachean Ethics. Quote, virtue is a state of character concerned with a choice, lying in a mean relative to us. This being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the person of practical wisdom would determine it. So I'm going to continue on here. Giles continues, the ethical course of action is relative to our particular circumstances, meaning that there is not one rule that fits all situations, but the ethical course of action is objectively true in that any rational person looking at the situation will be able to understand the correct ethical course of action. So the idea is that if you cultivate these virtues in your life, and especially you need to cultivate the virtue of wisdom or practical wisdom, then when you get into a situation, you'll be able to recognize what the right thing to do is. Now, for Aristotle, the right thing to do or the virtue is the mean between two extremes. And this chart here is quite helpful. So you've got two extremes. On the one hand, you've got the extreme of too little, and on the other hand, you've got the extreme of too much. And right down the middle is where we find the virtues, or the golden mean. So let's take the first one as an example, the virtue of bravery. That's right in the middle there. Now, if you look to your left, you see that you have the extreme of too little. That means if you lack this virtue, then you have this vice we would call cowardice. And if you have too much of this virtue, go to the other side, you have something we would call foolhardiness. So, for example, on the battlefield, a soldier who is brave is someone who steers right towards the middle, avoids cowardice on the left, and avoids foolhardiness or recklessness on the right. We call such people brave. Look at the second one, the virtue of generosity. So you can have too little generosity, and we might call you stinginess. And you might have too much generosity, and we'd say you'd be an example of profligacy. I don't usually say that word very often, so it's kind of stumbled over it. But the idea is that you're wasteful, right? You're extravagant. You're wasting your things, your goods. But if you're generous, then you're right in the middle. So if you're faced with needs in society, and let's say you have money to give to charity, then we would call you generous if you give it in the right way at the right time. Think of somebody who has a lot of money, who wants to give that money to charity, or even wants to donate their organs to patients who need it. We might say such a person is generous. And then we might also say that someone might go too far, right? And might just be wasteful with their wealth and even their organs, right? So how do we identify that? Well, that's something open for discussion. The next one is confidence. So we know that confidence is a virtue, right? You should be confident when making decisions in life, but you might also be boastful on the right. I'm sure you know people who are too proud. And on the other side, the other extreme might be self-critical. You're not confident enough in yourself. So the virtue is right in the middle. And finally, there's calmness. Having a character that's calm, that's a virtue. We like people like that. We also know people who are short-tempered. And that's one extreme. On the other extreme, we have people who are apathetic. And so those two extremes would be vices. Okay, so Giles says, quote, there are still ethical standards for a virtue ethicist, but they are relative to the situation. It is always wrong to eat too much, but, quote, too much will be different for each individual. So the nice thing about virtue ethics is that it is quite flexible and it accommodates different situations. Someone might be tempted to think, well, that sounds like it's relative. It sounds like moral relativism. But in fact, it's not exactly relative because there are things that are right and some things that are wrong. So for example, it is right to be honest. But what honesty is going to look like in any particular situation for the virtue ethicist might look a little different. So in some situations, it might look a certain way. It might not mean full disclosure, for example. When we look at the truly virtuous person, what does that person look like when they are doing something, when they're in action, doing a virtuous thing? Here are 4 bullet points to describe this. So a virtuous person knows what she or he is doing. For example, telling the truth. It's intentional, right? Second, chooses a virtuous act for its own sake, meaning wants to be truthful for the sake of honesty. And third, chooses as a result of a settled moral state. That means this choice or this action is coming out of a character of honesty. This honesty defines or describes this individual. And finally, chooses gladly and easily, meaning the choice comes out of a cultivation of this habit. They do this without much effort at all. Somebody who has to really struggle to tell the truth isn't fully virtuous. I mean, it might be a good action for that person still to tell the truth, but they're not fully virtuous yet. All right, let's go down a little bit. So I'm going to skip over some of these other ones here, let you read that on your own. But I'll go down to the objections to virtue ethics. Giles lists two objections. The first one is that virtue ethics is too vague and subjective. So the idea is that when we're looking at an ethical theory, we want a theory that gives us specifics, tells us what's the right thing to do in specific situations. And virtue ethics doesn't do that. At least it doesn't do that as well as some of the other theories. The response to this, the possible response to this objection would be, well, maybe that's the way the moral life just is. Maybe the moral life just is too complicated to summarize in concise rules. And if that's the case, this sort of vagueness, if you will, this the fact that it is a bit abstract is exactly what we should expect in a moral theory. So I'll let you decide whether that's a good response to it. And the second objection to virtue ethics is that there are different cultures and they seem to define human flourishing and virtues differently. This kind of goes back to one of the previous readings I've looked at, and that is the one about moral relativism or cultural relativism. Is it true that different cultures value different character traits, different virtues? It's not entirely clear to me, so this might be part of the response, that different cultures value different virtues, like as if some cultures would value honesty and other ones would value lying. I'm not sure that's the case. What might actually be the case is that there might be some facts or some underlying beliefs that might make the moral realities or the virtues look different on the surface. But when you look and dig deeper into the beliefs of that culture, or the traditions of that culture, you find that really both of these cultures value something like honesty or courage the same. They just see it working itself out in different ways, and it looks different the way that it's worked out. Anyways, I hope that's helpful to you, and we'll see you at the next one.